Have you ever been judged just because you dared to say no? In the late 19th century, in the suffocating Boston of the rules for good women, a girl named Clara Whitmore was sent back by her fiancé just because she was too stubborn. That short telegram was like a knife cutting through a woman's honor and confidence. But instead of falling, Clara stood up. She decided to leave the city, leave the pitying looks, to go west, where no one knew who she was, where the land and the wind only cared what you did, not who you were. In the arid lands of Montana, she meets Elias Monroe, a man of few words, old wounds, and a closed heart. He doesn't need a gentle wife. He needs the real one. And when he sees in Clara the fire that others call stubbornness, he realizes that it is what has kept him alive in the wilderness all these years. Today's story is not just a love story in the border region, but the journey of two people who have been hurt, learning to trust and love again. And perhaps, after listening to this story, you will ask yourself, if it were you, would you be brave enough to keep the fire in your heart even if the whole world tells you to turn it off? If you love stories about perseverance, kindness, and true love, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts to join us in a story that begins with a half-burned telegram. In the winter of 1887, Charleston was shrouded in a heavy fog of late winter. The streets were wet and cold. The carriage wheels screeched against the cobblestones, and the lighted windows of the red brick houses reflected a hazy yellow light as if trembling in the sea breeze. In a room on the third floor of Mrs. Langley's boarding house, Clara Whitmore sat alone at an old wooden table. The small fireplace in the corner had only a few half-burnt embers. She had just returned from the post office, still clutching the telegram. The paper was thin, the print bold, and only 12 words long, but each word cut like a knife into the heart. The engagement is off. You are unsuitable. Too stubborn. H. Lawson. Clara stared at the words, unable to believe that this was all a man could say after 4 months of correspondence, after promises of a home in the sunny West. She leaned back in her chair. A breeze blew in from the half-closed window, rustling the frayed curtains. The smell of salt and coal smoke mingled a smell only those who had lived long on the East Coast would be familiar with. The young woman closed her eyes and let the silence fall. At first, there was the humiliation, a splash of cold water in the face. She heard the sneering laughter of the women in the boarding house. Mrs. Langley whispering in the hallway, "Poor girl. No man can stand a woman who can't be gentle." Clara smiled faintly. No, she didn't cry. There were no more tears left for such judgments. 4 months ago, she had believed her life could change. She had left her monotonous typing job in a law office, scraped together every penny to send to Hudson's matrimonial agency. When she read a letter from Henry Lawson, a Wyoming miner, she thought it was her chance to leave the damp rooms of Charleston and start over in a land where men lived by hand and promise. But now, everything has evaporated, just because she dared to object in a letter. Just because she refused to agree with the view that a wife should know how to keep silent when a man speaks. Clara looked down at the piece of paper. The words were beginning to blur in the weak light of the oil lamp. She placed it on the table next to the metal box of matches. A small flame flared, touching the edge of the paper. The flame caught the words, "Too stubborn first," and she watched the flame burn as if it were swallowing a piece of the past. Thin smoke rose, charred slightly, and fell to the ground in ashes. She spoke softly, her voice almost an oath. "If they say I'm stubborn, well, I'll live by that stubbornness." The room was silent. Only the wind whistling through the cracks in the door and the slow ticking of the grandfather clock downstairs. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the foggy street. Somewhere in the distance, a train whistle echoed from the central station. It reminded her that there were other roads, other lands, where a woman's worth was not measured by her obedience. She touched the cold glass lightly, leaving a faint fingerprint. A thought flashed through her mind, fragile, but bright as a blade in the mist. Maybe it was time to leave Charleston. Her hands clenched. Her long-lost father's voice echoed in her head. "Daughter, if you don't choose your path, someone else will." Clara exhaled, her breath misting on the glass. The hurt gave way to a quiet determination. On the table, the piece of paper had burned down, leaving only a small trace of ash curled up like an exclamation point of fate. Clara gently brushed the ash away with her finger, letting it fall to the floor. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but at least tonight, she knew she wouldn't let anyone else write the rest of her life story but herself. Outside the window, the wind changed direction. The misty winter rain began to fall, each drop scattering on the roof like the slow beat of time. Clara cleared the table, closed the notebook with a few unfinished poems, lines she had written when she still believed in love through letters. She placed it on the shelf, right next to the old suitcase with the worn handle. The fire in the stove had died out, but in the girl's eyes, another light had just been lit, the light of self-respect and the desire for rebirth. She sat down and poured herself a cup of cold tea. The warmth faded, the bitter taste lingering on the tip of her tongue. She suddenly realized that it was not her fiancé who defined her, but the way she stood up after this fall that spoke of her true self. As the clock struck 9, Clara carefully folded her mother's handkerchief and put it in her coat pocket. She looked around the small room, the stained walls, the open window, the broken chair, and nodded slightly, as if saying goodbye to a part of her life. Outside, the mist was clearing, revealing a pale moonlight shining down on the street. The sound of horse-drawn carriage wheels faded into the night, mingling with the sound of church bells. Clara put on her coat, walked to the door, raised her head, and took a deep breath. In the salty cold of the sea, she felt more awake than ever. Perhaps somewhere across that vast land, another beginning awaits a place where no one needs her permission to be herself. She turned, extinguished the last embers in the fireplace, and turned off the light. The only light left was the moonlight shining on the ashes on the table, shimmering like a silent promise. Every ending is just the beginning of a new journey. The next morning, as the sun was just rising above the dew-dampened roof tiles, Clara took her small suitcase and headed to the Hudson's agency matchmaking office, the place where, just yesterday, fate had closed its doors to her, and now, perhaps, would open in a completely different way. The road to King Square was still wet with dew. The puddles of the night before had turned into a thin layer of ice, reflecting the dim morning light. Clara walked slowly, her breath vaporizing in the cold air. Each step was a reminder she was not looking back to ask for anything, only to close a door she had chosen to leave. The red brick Hudson's agency building loomed over the old town, its tarnished brass sign reading Hudson's Matrimonial and Companion Bureau, established 1878. The stone steps leading up to the door were dusted with snow. Clara paused for a moment, taking a deep breath. A small part of her still trembled, not with fear, but because she knew this place had once been the beginning of an unfulfilled dream. The wooden door creaked as she pushed it open. The smell of old paper, ink, and rosewater wafted through the air. The office was as it had always been. Long desks lined the walls. Small framed portraits of successful couples neatly hung. In the middle of the room, Mrs. Agatha Hudson, the owner, sat behind her desk, her glasses pushed down the bridge of her nose. When she saw Clara, Mrs. Hudson paused, her brows knitted together in surprise and apprehension, as if the girl's presence carried bad news. "Miss Whitmore," she said, her voice hoarse with a command rather than a question. "I thought you had already boarded the ship for Wyoming." Clara bowed slightly and removed her gloves. "I have received a telegram from Mr. Lawson," she replied evenly. "The engagement is off." A thick silence fell over the room. At the next table, two typists looked up, exchanged a quick glance, then bent down to continue typing, their hands noticeably slowing. In the corner, another young woman, presumably waiting for a file, shrank back slightly, as if afraid of being tainted by Clara's misfortune. Mrs. Hudson tapped her fingers lightly on the table. "I'm sorry," she said, but her eyes held no sympathy. "You know, Western men like women who are submissive. Perhaps you—" She paused, searching for the word, "have a strong personality." Clara was silent. Her lips curved slightly, not in a smile, but in an effort to hide her bitterness. In the cold light coming through the window, her face was visible, pale but bright, her eyes a small, smoldering, persistent fire. "Perhaps so," she replied lightly, "but I believe one cannot live by borrowing another's character." Mrs. Hudson sighed and picked up her teacup from the table. The rim had a small crack running down the length of the handle where it had been glued back together. She stirred her spoon gently, the clinking dry. "Girl," she said slowly, "you're young. Don't let pride keep you alone all your life. A woman should know when to calm down. Men don't like stubborn women." Clara looked at the cracked teacup, her eyes softening. She wasn't angry, just sad. "Mrs. Hudson," she said softly, "if that cup could talk, it would say cracked doesn't mean it's broken. It just means it's been through more than anyone knows." "Mrs. Hudson started, then pursed her lips. Her eyes wavered between pity and reproach. "You're still the same. Clara too blunt." She replied with a thin smile. "I think frankness is the last kindness left when one is judged for speaking the truth." In the corner of the room, a pendulum clock ticked, tick-tock regularly. The air was so heavy that one could hear the rain pattering on the glass window. A drop of water fell onto the wooden floor, creating a small streak, as if reflecting the mood of the woman trying to remain calm. Finally, Mrs. Hudson put down her teacup. "What are you going to do now?" Clara looked out at the street where the fog was clearing. "I don't know," she said. "Maybe I'll go west, where they don't ask a woman why she thinks differently." Mrs. Hudson raised an eyebrow. "The West is a harsh place. The land is dry, the wind is cold, and you will have to fend for yourself. It is no place for dreamers." Clara nodded slightly. "I don't dream anymore, ma'am. I just want to live by my own two hands." Mrs. Hudson looked at her longer. A faint, fleeting admiration flickered in the pragmatic eyes of the woman who had brokered hundreds of marriages. She nodded slightly, then opened a drawer and pulled out a brown envelope. "There's one more letter I haven't had time to look at," she said, pushing the envelope toward Clara. "It's from a man in Montana. He wrote that he wanted a wife who was brave, hard-working, and not afraid of dry land and cold winds. Clara reached out and took it, her fingertips lightly touching the sandpaper. For a moment, the wind from the window whistled, shaking the curtains, making the light flicker on the tabletop as if the whole room were breathing with her. She didn't open the letter right away. She just looked at the envelope, at the strange man's slanted handwriting, and felt her heart flutter, not with hope, but with a deep quiet, a chance to start over, not to be loved, but to be true. His name is Elias Monroe, Mrs. Hudson added, her voice lower. A widower, 36 years old. I hear his ranch is between two hills in northern Montana. Clara nodded, her eyes falling to the envelope. Her fingers lightly brushed the worn red seal. No one in the room knew that in that moment. Her decision had taken shape silent but certain, like a seed lying deep beneath the snow, waiting for spring. She looked up and smiled. Thank you, Mrs. Hudson. I'll think about it. Then she turned and left. The door closed behind her, leaving behind the sound of the wind and the scent of cold tea. Mrs. Hudson watched, her hand gently touching the cracked teacup. Something inside her cracked so slightly, but enough to make her sigh. Outside, Clara walked down the snow-covered stone steps, the cold wind blowing through her hair. She opened the envelope, read the first lines from a stranger in the middle of nowhere, Montana, and realized there were no flowery promises, just short, honest sentences, the way Westerners talk about their lives. I don't need someone to talk to for fun. I need someone to grow hay with and endure the wind with. If you're not afraid of silence, there's a place for you here. Clara closed the letter and stood still for a long time in the crowded street. The first snowflake of the season fell into her hand, melting quickly, cold but pure, and in her heart, she knew she had found her way. That afternoon, as the No. 9 train prepared to leave Charleston Station for the west, Clara stood on the platform amidst the wind and smoke, carrying with her a decision she had not expected, a journey that would lead her to the land where destiny quietly waited. But before she boarded the train, Clara had one thing left undone, a thin but heavy string tied to her heart. She returned to Hudson's agency, where the oil lamp in the window still glowed a quiet yellow in the late afternoon. The office was deserted, except for the smell of cold tea and the faint sound of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Agatha Hudson was still sitting there, in the worn leather chair, reading a newspaper. When she heard the door open, she looked up, her eyes behind her round glasses flashing with surprise. "Miss Whitmore, I thought you were gone." Clara shook her head slightly, took off her gloves, and walked over to the table. "I'll go. But before I go, I think I should thank you. Mrs." Hudson put down the paper, folded her arms, and looked stern and pitying. "Thank me for what? Because of Mr. Monroe's letter," Clara replied, her voice low but firm. "You may not know it, but sometimes just the chance to be heard is enough to make a man want to try again at life. Mrs." Hudson sighed, tapping her fingers on the table. "Clara, you are a smart girl, and I appreciate that. But listen to me. Life is not as gentle with women as we are. Out there, if you don't keep your head down, the wind will knock you down." Clara looked at her eyes bright but not hostile, just the quiet light of one who knows too well the price of pride. "Maybe," she said softly, "but I bowed my head before, and the wind still blew me down." Mrs. Hudson frowned. "You talk as if you were challenging the world. But the world doesn't need more challenging women. My dear, it needs people who can get along and smile at the right time." Clara slowly sat down on the chair opposite. her hands clasped in her lap. Her voice was even and deep. Not high but clear, Mrs. Hudson, have you ever been married? The question made her pause. She looked at her for a long time, then answered softly, I did, a long time ago. And if your husband tells you not to speak, not to object, what will you do? Mrs. Hudson was silent. The afternoon light filtered through the window, illuminating the lines that ran from the corners of her eyes to her chin, the lines of years and of things unsaid. There are things, she said finally, a woman must accept in order to be at peace. Clara looked down at her hands. I am not looking for peace, she said. I am looking for a life where I can have my own voice. If I have to choose between solitude and silence, I will choose solitude. Her voice wasn't harsh. It was like the wind through a half-open door, soft, but cold. Mrs. Hudson looked at the young woman before her, and suddenly saw a glimpse of herself at 25 when she believed that courage could buy freedom. She looked away, picking up her teacup from the table. A thin crack ran down the handle, like an old wound. She turned the cup silently in her hands. Her mouth pursed. You don't know what lies in the West. Clara, she said, her voice softer. The winds there can tear clothes, and the loneliness can make the heart colder than snow. Clara nodded slightly. I'm not afraid of the wind, and I've known loneliness. Here in Charleston, you can be in a crowd and still not be heard. In other places, at least I can be silent in my own way. A faint smile played at the corner of Mrs. Hudson's lips, not exactly joy, but a helpless acceptance. You sound like someone who's gone too far to turn back. Maybe so, Clara whispered. Mrs. Hudson stood up, walked to the wooden cabinet behind her, and pulled out a small box. She opened the lid and took out a silver hairpin engraved with a wild rose. I can't give you better advice, she said, placing it in Clara's hand. But this I wore when I left home at 17. Keep it. It's not worth much, but it might help you remember sometimes being stubborn is a way of surviving. Clara squeezed the brooch gently in her palm. The silver reflected the lamplight, faint but warm. She looked at Mrs. Hudson, her eyes wet but still bright. Thank you, she said softly. Not for the gift, but for the kindest thing you've said to me today. Mrs. Hudson turned away, hiding her soft eyes behind her glasses. Go away before I change my mind, she muttered. Clara smiled slightly, bowed, and walked out of the office. The door closed, leaving behind the scent of old tea and the swaying light of the oil lamp. Outside, it was snowing. The snowflakes fell slowly, thick and light, like a white blanket covering the winter city. She clutched Elias Monroe's envelope tightly in her hand, feeling her heart beat slow but steady like the sound of train wheels fading away. This time, no one sent her. She chose. And amid Charleston's chilly early winter winds, Clara knew she was embarking on a journey not just to find a new place, but to prove that a woman can go through life without asking anyone's permission to be herself. That night, at Charleston Grand Central Station, Clara stood in the bitter wind and the swirling coal smoke, clutching the ticket that read Montana Territory. Yeah, she had no idea what awaited her on the other side of the horizon, but she knew that, for the first time in her life, she was no longer afraid. The train whistle sounded in the middle of the night, like a call from another world. Clara stood on the platform, in her old dark brown coat. The wind, carrying the smell of coal and steam, blew a few strands of hair out of her small cap. People hurried, some boarding the train, some saying goodbye, each with their own sorrow in their eyes. She opened her hand and looked at the yellowed ticket and the crumpled letter she had read word for word, the letter from Elias Monroe. The tone of the writing was different, simple and surprisingly honest. I can't promise much. My ranch is on the northern edge of Montana, less than 30 miles from town. Winters here are harsh, with winds blowing all night. I lost my wife 2 years ago, and it's just me in the barren land. If you don't mind dry land and silence, I can pay you with trust. I need someone with guts rather than sweet words. The words were rough, without a word of sweetness, but it was that simplicity that made Clara pause at each line. There was no flirtation, no eternal promise, just honesty, and that, to her, was as rare as the first light of a cold January day. She remembered Mrs. Hudson's words. Sometimes, being stubborn is also a way of survival. Clara smiled slightly. Yes, if life was a series of forks in the road that others had planned, then this time she would choose the path that no one else dared to take. As the train began to move, she climbed into the third-class carriage, reserved for laborers, farmers, and those leaving the country in search of a new life. The carriage shuddered, the iron wheels grinding slowly over the rails. Through the glass windows, the red brick buildings of Charleston receded into the mist, then disappeared into the darkness. Clara sat down, hugging her small suitcase tightly. Fear and hope mingled like two streams of cold and warm water. Next to her, a young mother sang softly to her baby, and in the far corner, a man slept soundly, his cowboy hat half covering his face. The whole train seemed to breathe softly to the rhythm of the swaying wheels. She opened the letter again, the oil lamplight flickering on the pages. At the end of the letter, Elias had written only one short line, in contrast to the dryness of the previous part. If you agree to come. I will be waiting at Elk Creek Station on January 14th. I can't talk much, but I will come. No promises of love, no pleas. Just a single sentence, as true as the land he lived in. She read it over and over again, then gently folded the letter and placed it in her inner pocket, where she always kept her most important things. The train ran through the night, through bare forests, small towns fading under the warm yellow light. In the steady roar of the engine, Clara felt the past fading away, becoming lighter. Though somewhere the pain still lingered, she thought of Henry Lawson, the man who had sent her back with just 12 words in a telegram. The humiliation of that day had now faded into a distant memory, because at this very moment, as she sat on the train heading towards the harshest land in America, she knew she was no longer being sent back. She was going to the night passed. Clara woke to a weak light streaming through the window on her second morning on the train. Outside, the landscape was different. Low mountains appeared, grassland stretched to the horizon, covered in the gray-brown of the northern winter. A hawk soared in the distance, alone but free. Clara looked at the scene and felt a strange feeling of being small and strong at the same time. Perhaps, she thought, it is in the most solitary places that one finds one's courage. She opened her notebook and wrote a few lines while the train rocked gently. They say Montana is a land of wind and silence, but perhaps it is in that silence that one can hear one's true voice. Each letter trembles to the rhythm of the train, like a breath of hope. That afternoon, when the train stopped at the transfer station near St. Louis, Clara got off to buy some pastries and hot tea. An older man sitting at the counter looked at her, his voice hoarse. "Where are you going?" "Girl, Montana," she replied. He raised his eyebrows. land of snowstorms and quiet men. Do you have relatives there? No. She smiled. But maybe I will. The old man nodded slightly, watching her figure step onto the train, as if seeing his own image from years ago, a youth searching for a place where no one knew his name to start over. As the train started to move again, the sky began to darken. A few scattered lights appeared in the distance, like falling stars. Clara leaned her head against the window, listening to the wind that blew through the gaps in the carriage. Each sound told a story of people leaving home, of people waiting, of people who had lost everything but still chose to believe in tomorrow. She thought of Elias Monroe, the man who wrote dry but honest letters. She didn't know what he looked like, what his voice sounded like, only that he had lost a wife and was still brave enough to find warmth in another. Perhaps, she whispered, honesty is the rarest of all things in this age of saying what one does not mean. Outside, snow began to fall, the first flakes of a new journey. She watched them drift past the window, melting into the darkness, and closed her eyes. Sleep came as lightly as a breath, bringing with it images of a faraway land where people lived with their hands and loved with trust. When the train stopped at Elk Creek Station early on the morning of January 14th, Clara saw a man waiting by the old stagecoach. He wore a brown flannel coat, and his eyes were as kind and quiet as Montana itself. Their first handshake, strong, cautious, but with something very real in it. But before that moment, it was a long journey, starting on that gray Charleston morning when Clara boarded the steamer, the Western Star. Fog still covered the river, and the dawn light was just faint enough to reveal the steam rising from the engine. The landscape was hazy, like the fragile boundary between what had been and what was yet to come. Clara stood on the platform, clutching the strap of her suitcase. She could hear her heart beating over the rumble of the engines, the bustle of people in the corridors, and her own breathing even. Slow, but steady. No one saw her off. No one knew if this trip was to get married or to run away. Only she knew this was a journey to find herself. The train let out a long whistle and started moving. The iron wheels scraped against the rails, pushing the city back, the wet-tiled roofs, the familiar streets, the once heavy memories now fading into the white smoke. Clara sat by the window in the train. She watched the scenery pass by, rows of red brick houses, then wild fields, then pine forests shrouded in mist. Occasionally, a ray of sunlight filtered through a gap in the clouds, reflecting on the glass in pale streaks of light, thin as an old promise. She touched her pocket lightly where she held the letter from Elias Monroe. The paper was crumpled, the edges frayed, but to her it was more than a letter. It was a map to a land where people could live without asking anyone's permission to be themselves. Clara opened her notebook and wrote a few lines. Everyone has a place to go. Some call it home. Some call it redemption. I call it faith, the only thing I carry. She closed the window, leaned her head against the window, and let the sound of the train blend with the wind. The people in the carriage gradually fell silent. A child dozed on his mother's shoulder. An old man clasped his hands in prayer. Among them, Clara found herself entering a different kind of silence, not of solitude, but of steadfastness. 3 days passed. The train passed through gray rocky mountains, snow-covered plains, and small towns with only a few roofs and an inn. Each morning, as the dawn broke through her window, she saw the landscape change, as if her own soul were being washed, bit by bit. One night, as the train stopped at a service stop in the middle of the wilderness, Clara stepped off the platform to get some fresh air. It was bitterly cold. She looked up at the Montana sky for the first time, vast, starry, and so quiet she could hear her own heartbeat. She understood why people called the West the land of rebirth. For here, everything started again from ashes towns built on deserts, farms sprouted in the wind, and people who, after losing everything, still dared to sow seeds of hope in dry soil. Clara clenched her fists. "I didn't come here to get married," she told herself. "I came here to work, to prove I can stand the wind." In the carriage, an elderly woman looked at her and smiled softly. "Young lady, you have come a long way." "The West is not for the faint of heart," Clara replied with a firm gaze. "I am not weak, madam. I am just tired of being silent." The woman nodded, smiled, and turned away. In that moment, Clara felt she was no longer alone. Although each person on the train had their own story, they had one thing in common. They were all searching for something they had lost. As the train approached Montana, the snow grew deeper, the wind colder, but the sky grew bluer and deeper. The sunlight reflected off the white fields, so bright it made her squint. Clara put her hand on the window frame, and a feeling she couldn't quite name filled her. Not quite joy, not quite sadness, but a quiet reverence for a land harsh enough to test any heart. She thought of Mrs. Hudson, of the silver hairpin she had given her, a small object that carried a message. Sometimes being stubborn is a way of life. Clara took the hairpin out and pinned it to her hair. The silver reflected the snow, sparkling like a small fire in the middle of winter. Late in the afternoon, as the train was approaching Elk Creek, Clara added one last line in her notebook. "If life is a train, the most precious thing is not where we arrive, but the courage to get on." Outside, the sun was slowly setting behind the mountains. The orange light spread across the snow like a long streak of fire, illuminating the still sky. The train let out a long, echoing whistle, then slowed down. Clara packed her things, put on her coat, and her heart beat faster. The fear, though still there, now took on the form of life. She stood up, gripping the handrail as the train came to a stop. The sound of metal brakes sounded like the beginning of a new chapter. When the doors opened, cold air rushed in, carrying with it the smell of earth, wind, and snow, the real smell of the West. On the platform, there were a few people waiting for relatives, a few people carrying goods, and among them, a tall, sturdy man in a brown overcoat, a wide-brimmed hat covering half his face. His eyes found hers immediately, a look that was neither curious nor eager, just the quiet of someone who was used to loss, but still knew how to cherish what remained. Clara stepped down the steps, her hands trembling slightly in the wind. The man approached, nodding slightly. "Miss Whitmore?" His voice was low, slightly hoarse, like the wind through the pines. "Yes," she said. "And you must be Elias Monroe." He nodded slightly. They stood there, in the snow, saying nothing more, just a handshake strong, cautious, but real. At that moment, Clara understood sometimes. Fateful decisions do not come from love at first sight, but from the silence of two souls knowing they are on the right track. That afternoon, Elias drove Clara back to his farm. It was a 6-hour drive through the snow-covered meadows, between them only the sound of hooves and the wind. Silence became the common language, and in that wilderness, all beginnings were made in silence. But before they got in, they stood looking at each other for a long time. Elk Creek Station was a small, pale yellow pine structure, with a silver-tinted roof and a battered iron sign bearing the town's name, worn by the wind. The north wind blew in gusts, mixed with dusting snow, making the sign rattle. Clara stood on the steps, clutching her suitcase. Behind her, the railroad tracks stretched to the horizon, covered in a blanket of snow that seemed untouched. And ahead, Elias Monroe, a man she knew only from a few lines, walked slowly, carefully. He wore a wide-brimmed hat, a dusty brown tweed coat, and worn leather gloves. Each step he took imprinted itself in the snow, steady and slow, as if the whole land knew his pace. As he approached, Elias stopped, took off his glove, and held it out. "Miss Whitmore." His voice was husky, deep and calm, like a river in winter. "Yes," she replied, and held out her hand, their first handshake strong, guarded, without a word to spare. Elias's palm was warmer than she expected. His fingers were calloused, the marks of years of work, not just the hands of a man, but of the land he lived on. Clara looked straight into his eyes. There was no scrutiny, no pity, only sincere silence. Elias nodded slightly, then said, "The car's out there. It's getting dark." She nodded and followed him. The wooden wheels sank deep into the snow, creaking like the old heartbeat of time. The black horse, lean but strong, exhaled white breaths as it pulled the cart up the slope. Clara sat in the back seat, clutching her suitcase. Elias sat beside her, holding the reins with both hands. They said nothing. The wind whistled past, carrying tiny snowflakes that brushed against her shoulders. After a few minutes, Elias spoke up. "You have little luggage," she replied, her voice low but clear. "That's a good thing," he said. "Here, people only need what they need." Another silence. Clara looked out the window. The landscape changed. The small town of Elk Creek receded. A few roofs hidden in the mist, then opened up into the deserted fields, white, cold, and vast. The wind picked up. Wooden fences and windmills appeared and disappeared. The sun slowly set, leaving a thin orange streak at the foot of the mountain. The light was angled, reflecting off Elias's face. She saw his sunburnt cheekbones, his gray eyes sad but not weak. The face of someone who had suffered loss, but still had enough faith to invite a stranger to live with him. Clara asked softly, "Is your farm far from here?" "About 6 hours' walk," he replied. "Over 2 streams, a pine field, and a slope. With luck, we'll get there before the snow gets any deeper. And if not, then we'll stop at the hunting lodge halfway. There's a fireplace there." She smiled slightly, not at what he said, but at the way he said it, straightforward, unadorned, without pretense of politeness, just like in the letter. The farther they went, the quieter it became. There was only the sound of the wheels digging into the soft snow and the breathing of the horses. Clara looked toward the horizon, where the sunset was receding from the hills. She felt a strange feeling rising inside her, a quiet equality. There was no one above them, no one below them. She was not a bride to be saved, and he was not a hero to be protected. They were just 2 people, each with an emptiness, trying to fill it with something as simple as trust. The wagon shook as it crossed the icy stream. Elias held the reins gently, his voice carrying through the wind. "It's not easy to live in the West." "I didn't come here because it was easy," Clara replied. "I came because I really wanted to live." Elias glanced at her, just for a moment, but the look said more than any words. This girl was unlike anyone he had ever met, not weak, nor in need of pity. The last light of dusk faded. Night fell. leaving only a faint moon shining on the snowy fields. Elias stopped the cart and lit a small oil lamp hanging from the end of the shaft. The swaying yellow light reflected on the two people's faces. Clara saw his breath smoke in the cold air and felt her heart slow. There was something so still, so real about that moment, as if the whole world had stopped to watch two strangers begin a new chapter in their lives. She said softly, "Thank you for coming to pick me up." Elias replied, briefly, "Thank you for coming." There was no smile. There was no lingering look, but between them there was a thread of trust, and it was that thread that would weave the rest of the story. The wind blew harder, and the snow began to thicken. Elias lightly tapped the horse's back. The carriage rolled, leaving a long trail on the vast white ground. In the darkness, Clara tilted her head slightly to look outside. The oil lamplight shone through, illuminating the snow, shimmering like 1,000 stars falling to the ground. And she knew her healing journey had truly begun. During the 6 hours of riding across the prairie, they did not speak much. The sound of horses' hooves, the wind, and small gestures dividing water, adjusting reins, pulling on blankets became the only way they understood each other. In that silence, the first trust was planted like a seed in winter. The carriage rolled slowly on the snow-covered road, leaving 2 deep tracks like letters written on the desolate ground. It was late afternoon. The fragile light fell obliquely on the vast grassland with no visible edge. In the distance, the snow-capped mountains stood silently like an ancient wall, separating this world from the rest. Clara pulled her woolen shawl tight, her breath billowing white. The wind blew hard, carrying the smell of cold earth and pine resin. Under the thin layer of snow, the wheels occasionally hit a hidden stone, making her sway slightly, and Elias leaned over again, holding the reins tightly, his voice low. "Are you okay?" "Okay," she replied. Just 2 short words, but enough for him to turn and nod. From then on, they fell silent again. Not the silence of distance, but the silence of people learning to listen to each other by not speaking. Ahead, the sun gradually disappeared behind the hill, leaving a pale yellow light drifting along the snow surface. The wind changed direction, carrying with it the steady sound of horse bells. Every sound, every breath of heaven and earth seemed to accompany them as they walked to an unknown place. Clara looked around the field stretched as far as the eye could see. Not a soul, not a trace of a city, just nature, stark and majestic. A beauty so beautiful that it made one feel both afraid and small, she said softly, almost whispering to herself. Here, people are judged by what you do, not what you say. Elias didn't reply, but the corners of his lips lifted slightly. Perhaps he had thought the same thing, many years ago. They came to a gentle slope where the wind was blowing against them, and the birch trees cast long shadows on the snow. Elias stopped the car, jumped out, and cleared the ice from around the axles. She tried to get out to help, but he said, "Stay put. It will only take a minute." She went down, though the wind stung her face. "Let me hold the light," she said, and without waiting for an answer, took up the swaying oil lamp. The trembling yellow light fell on his hand, the black hand, which was using a knife to scrape away patches of ice. Elias looked up at her. In the dim light, their eyes met again. There were no words, just a silent acknowledgement. She was not one to wait for help, and he was not one to want anyone to kowtow to him. Together they pushed the wheel, the snow crackling underfoot. As the wheel turned, Elias said in a hoarse but warm voice, "Are you used to manual labor?" "I lived in Boston," she said. But the city taught me that if you have a soft hand, it's hard to keep what you want." He smiled slightly. A brief, rare smile, but genuine. They got back into the carriage. As they continued on, the sky was dyed a deep purple. A new moon rose behind the mountains, its silvery light reflecting off the snow. The landscape was enveloped in a divine stillness, the kind of stillness only felt in the wilderness. Elias took a small bottle of water from his pocket and held it out to her. "You should drink some." Clara took it, their hands touching lightly. A brief moment, but enough for her to realize that warmth in the cold always found a way to exist, even if it was just through a touch. The water in the jug tasted of iron and was cold, but it felt warm as it went down her throat. She handed it back to him, and he nodded his thanks and continued holding the reins. They didn't ask about the past, didn't talk about the future. It was all about small gestures, Elias leaning to shield himself from the wind when the snow blew back in her face, Clara gently pulling the fur blanket over his shoulders when the wind turned cold. No one said thank you. In this land, kindness doesn't need words. After a while, Ellis pointed into the distance. "See, that light is my farm." She squinted. In the middle of the vast sea of snow, a small, star-like light was burning in the sky. The light was weak, but steady. "Too low," she said softly. "Yes," he replied, "but it never goes off." The car continued to roll. The wind still howled, but now it sounded like the old song of this land, low, sad, and deep. Clara leaned her head back on the seat, her eyes following the distant light. She felt strange inside, but not afraid. No longer the woman who was returned in disgrace, no longer the one seeking refuge. Now, she was the one who was coming, with the raw pride of one who had chosen her own path. A sudden gust of wind blew past. The small hat on her head almost flew off. Elias reached out to catch it. "Be careful," he said. Clara smiled slightly. "Thank you." He looked at her for a moment, then looked ahead. The light from the farmhouse grew brighter and clearer through the snow. She knew that in a few minutes they would arrive at the place where another life would begin, where she would have to face the earth, the wind, and herself. But right now, in the steady sound of the horses and the long moonlight, she felt strangely at peace. In life, there are journeys that begin not with love, but with trust and respect, the very thing that all true love is born from. When they arrived at the farmhouse, their first supper consisted of cold bread, baked beans, and a flickering oil lamp. But in the soft yellow light, the silence between them began to melt, not with words, but with warmth and gentle looks. Elias's wooden house stood alone in the middle of a snow-covered valley. The moonlight shone on the gray tin roof, making the house seem to be immersed in the hazy breath of night. When the carriage stopped, Clara looked around silently. No lights except the flickering fire in the small window. Elias got out first, opened the car door, and held out his hand to her. "We're here," he said softly. Clara put her hand on his and stepped down. The ground was hard and numbingly cold underfoot. The wind whipped through, carrying the smell of burning wood from inside the house. She looked around, the small stable to the east, the low fence that stretched toward the pine forest, and in the distance, the frozen stream. The scene was wild, but strangely still, as if time here ran slower than in the rest of the world. Elias pushed open the door. Inside was a single room, just big enough for 2 people, a rough wooden table, 2 chairs, a small fire, and a few shelves containing simple utensils. On the table were a plate of cold beans, a loaf of dry bread, and a kettle of simmering water. Clara stood in the doorway, listening to the wind whistling softly outside the wooden walls. She inhaled the scent of smoke and freshly brewed tea, the scent of a real life. Not glamorous, not easy, but so real it warmed the heart. Elias hung his coat on a hook, poured 2 cups of tea, and handed her one. No milk. "I hope you don't mind." She shook her head slightly. Black tea is better than silence. He nodded slightly, as if taking in something about her. They sat across from each other, the lamplight illuminating their faces. In that moment, Clara noticed that Elias's eyes, pale ash after a fire, were not cold, but sad. She knew that look. It was the look of someone who had lost something he never thought he would lose. "Mrs. Hudson said you lived in the city," he said evenly. "Yes, in Charleston, where the sound of carriages is barely over before the church bells begin to ring. Everything is hurried and noisy. Here," he said, "we don't have much to make noise about, just the wind and work." She chuckled. "I think I can work." He looked at her longer, then nodded. "Tomorrow morning, if you like. We'll start in the stables. Those animals are easier to please than people." Clara smiled, a small, warm smile. "Then I choose to be with them before you." Elias smiled briefly, the first smile of the night. Very small, but enough to make the room less cold. Outside, the wind whistled through the cracks in the door. Inside, the oil lamp swayed, its light touching their faces like a small flame. After a few minutes of silence, Elias said, almost confessing, "I'm not good at talking." Clara looked at him, her voice calm. "Then let's work together." A simple sentence, but it seemed to shorten the distance between them. No longer guest and host, no longer newcomer and old resident, just 2 people, sitting together in front of a cold meal, in the middle of a simple room, sharing the same breath of life. They ate in silence. The knife clicked lightly on the wooden plate. The fire crackled in the stove. Clara took in every detail, the light, the sounds, the smell of smoke, the chill in the air, all of it creating a scene both harsh and peaceful. She realized she was no longer afraid, maybe because here, people did not need to pretend to be loved. Just be sincere, be real with your eyes. When the meal was almost done, Elias stood up and added a few more logs to the fire. The flames flared up, illuminating the cracks in the wall and the light in her eyes. He turned back, his voice slow. "There will be work tomorrow. The land around here is not easy to live in." "Fortunately," she replied, "I didn't come for the easy." Elias looked at her again. Their eyes met in the firelight. No romance, just respect, pure and calm as the burning oil lamp. When she stood up to help clear the table, he said softly, "Let me do it. You must be tired." "No," she replied. "I don't want to be a guest here." He paused, then gave way. No one said anything more. They simply washed the wooden plates together in the cold water basin, their hands brushing a few times, awkward, natural, and without apology. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Each flake that touched the ground felt like a breath of winter. Inside the small house, the fire in the hearth slowly died down to a red glow. Elias gently blew out the lamp, leaving only the dim glow of the stove. "You sleep in the back room. I'll lie out here. That's all there is to the house." "That's enough," she said. "Enough to start over." He nodded and gently closed the door. In the darkness, the sound of the wind outside mixed with the warmth in the room, creating a quiet rhythm as smooth as a heartbeat slowly finding peace. The first days on the farm passed in silence, except for the sound of saws, the lowing of cows, and the wind whistling around the roof. Clara worked until her hands bled, but she did not complain. As for Elias, he watched her from afar and realized that there was something in this woman that made the world stand still. Clara woke the first morning, before the sun rose above the pines. A thick fog blanketed the Elk Creek Valley. The cold seeped through her woolen coat, turning every breath to steam. She lit a fire, boiled water, and stepped out into the stables. The path leading to the stables was muddy and icy at the water's edge. The wind blew through his coat, carrying with it the scents of hay, horse manure, and the dampness of winter earth, all of it a very real, very alive scent. Clara opened the barn door, and the old cow nudged her shoulder in greeting. She smiled and patted its forehead. "Calm down. You're still impatient for an old man," she said softly, her voice as gentle as if she were talking to an old friend. Inside, she began to clear the straw, shovel the manure, and replace the new layer of grass. Her hands were quick and decisive, not because she was used to it, but because of her will. Each movement had the strange determination of someone who wanted to prove that she belonged here. When Elias stepped out into the courtyard, he saw her silhouette in the mist, small but sturdy. She wore a thick sweater, the sleeves rolled up, a few strands of hair hanging loosely over her forehead. The early morning light shone through, making her whole person seem to be surrounded by a thin glow. Beauty not from her figure, but from her quiet efforts. He didn't call, just stood there at the barn door, watching her work. A cow butted lightly, pushing the bucket of water, spilling water on Clara's hands. She started, but didn't cry out. She pursed her lips, smiled, and picked the bucket back up. Her hands were red and scratched. Her thumbs were bleeding, but she didn't stop. "You should wear gloves," Elias said, his voice low. Clara looked up, sweat dampening her hair. "I need to get a feel for the work," she said. "Gloves make me feel like I'm still a stranger here." He said nothing more. He just nodded slightly, then walked over to help her push the bundle of straw. They worked in silence, the only sounds being the fire in the stove and the wind outside. In that silence, Elias realized she was not like the other women who had come here, those who carried expectations, then fear when facing life on the frontier. She was not afraid of the land, not afraid of the cold, and not afraid of herself. At noon, they sat on the porch steps to rest. She handed him a wooden cup of water. Her hands were bleeding, and some of the cracks had dried. He saw and said softly, "You don't have to do so much." She smiled. "If I didn't do it, who would believe that I could live here?" He didn't answer, but his look silent and deep said he believed. Believed from the moment she set foot on Montana soil. That afternoon, the wind picked up. Gray clouds rolled down from the mountains, carrying fine snow. The two of them gathered firewood, splitting it and piling it up against the wall. As Elias split the logs, the axe blade sparked. She stood beside him, picking up the small splinters, her hands chapped, but her eyes bright. For a moment, as she bent down, Elias saw those hands thin, sunburned, bloody, but in those hands he saw the strength and courage he thought had vanished from this world. At night, Clara cooked beans again, and the aroma filled the little house. Elias sat by the door, quickly wiping the snow off his shirt, listening to the sound of the ladle tapping lightly on the pot. He was surprised, since when had such a simple sound made him feel so peaceful? As she placed the bowl of beans on the table, he said softly, "You know, since my wife passed away, This house has never been so warm." She stopped and looked up. The oil lamplight fell on her face, gentle and unpitying. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "it is not the house that is warm, but your heart that is warming." Elias was silent for a moment, then chuckled. "Maybe so." They ate dinner in silence, but it was a warm silence. Outside, the wind was howling. The snow was falling. But inside the little house, a red fire was burning, from the hearth and from within. Clara looked at her hands rough, sore, and smiled slightly. They hurt, but real. She had never felt so real. As for Elias, he looked at her through the smoke from the kitchen stove, and saw in that woman something he could not name. A belief, a strength, a faint but lasting light, a light he thought had been lost with the past. That night, after she had fallen asleep, he sat before the fireplace. The fire burned low, and he thought, perhaps God did not send me a wife, but someone to remind me that life is not about letting go. In the following days, the snow fell harder. The work became harder, but Clara persevered. One morning, when she fell while skating, Elias ran to catch her, and in that grasp, something silently changed between them, as light as the first breath of the morning. After that morning, no one spoke again, but there was an invisible bond between them, not exactly love, but an unspoken trust. Then, one night, a snowstorm came from the mountains. The wind howled outside, cold as a knife. Snow pounded against the wooden walls, making the house shake slightly. In the kitchen, the fire crackled weakly, trying to maintain a fragile warmth amidst the fury of nature. Elias was mending a broken rein when he heard the door open slightly. He turned to see Clara, wrapped in a thick woolen coat and hat, preparing to step outside. "Where are you going?" His voice rose, dry and strained. "The stallion is scared. I heard him banging on the stable door," she said. "I'll take care of it. Stay inside." "No, I'm used to taking care of him." He stood up, his voice serious. "The storm is getting closer. You'd be foolish to go out there." Clara looked up, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the oil lamp. "Elias, I didn't come here to be confined within four walls." Her words fell, light but sharp as a knife, cutting through the silence. The small room seemed to shrink. Only the sound of the wind blowing outside could be heard. Elias took a step toward her, his voice low. "I just want you to be safe, and I just want to be free. Those two things are not mutually exclusive." He tightened his grip on the reins. Something rose in his chest. Not anger, exactly, but fear. Fear of losing something he had yet to understand. She opened the door. The wind rushed in, freezing cold. Snow flew white, whipping through her hair and clothes. Elias ran after her and grabbed her arm. "You have no idea what it's like out there, and you have no idea what I've been through to get here." The two stood facing each other in the snow, their breaths mingling in a hazy mist. Between them, the oil lamp from the door shone weakly but persistently, like the only remaining light in the midst of a storm. Finally, Elias let go. He knew there was no way to hold someone back with fear. "All right," he said softly, his voice almost breaking, "but don't be gone too long." She nodded slightly, then walked away, her figure fading into the thick snow. Elias stood in the doorway, watching her silhouette flicker in the pale moonlight. The wind whipped the snow around his feet, cold, but his heart burned. Outside the stable, Clara could see almost nothing but a blinding white. She walked along the fence, shielding herself from the wind. Every step was a challenge. The snow clung to her coat, growing heavier, and the wind threatened to knock her to the ground. When they arrived, the stallion was neighing loudly and kicking hard against the door. Clara opened the latch and stepped into the stable. She gently stroked its neck, her voice trembling slightly. "Calm down. It's okay." The animal lowered its head, its hot breath fanning over her hand. Clara smiled. Despite the blizzard outside, the moment felt strangely peaceful. She tied the rope again, checked the manger, and then turned to go back. But as she stepped out, a strong gust of wind blew past her, making her sway. The barn door burst open and snow rushed in. She fell, her hands slipping on the hard ice. Just then, a strong hand grabbed her wrist and pulled her up. "It's Elias." He said nothing, just held her tight, pulling her to him. They both shivered in the wind. He pulled his cloak over her shoulders, holding her close, his voice choked with cold and something deeper. "I thought I'd lost you." She looked up, her eyes filled with tears, both tired and warm. "You can't lose something you never had." He was silent. The wind was still blowing, the snow was still flying, but it seemed like something had just melted, not the snow, but the wall between their hearts. They walked back into the house together. The door closed behind them, muffling the wind. The fire in the kitchen was nearly out, and Elias knelt to rekindle it. Clara sat beside him, her hands chapped and her face pale with cold. He looked at her, then said softly, "I don't know how to protect you without making you feel imprisoned. Maybe I don't understand enough." She looked at him, her voice slow. "And perhaps I also don't understand that. Sometimes other people's care is not a chain. Adi tiend vows, but a roof." Both were silent. Only the growing firelight cast their shadows on the wall. Two figures, one tall, one small, but side by side, neither overwhelming nor bowing. The storm outside still howled, but in the wooden house, the silence had changed. It was no longer a silence of caution, but of understanding after the hurt. Elias looked at her one last time before turning out the lamp. "Thank you," he said softly. "For what?" "For going out into the storm and coming back." Clara did not reply. She just looked at the burning fire and said softly in her heart, "Perhaps to truly live. Sometimes one must dare to leave one's safe place, even if no one is waiting for one's return." The next morning, the snow had stopped falling. The sky was strangely clear over the fields. Elias and Clara mended the fence that had been broken by the storm, without much talk. But with each hammer blow, each piece of wood they laid together, there was an echo of something being mended. The sun rose slowly behind the mountains, casting a pale yellow light over the snow-covered ground. Everything sparkled the drops of water on the broken fence, the reflections on the roof, and even Clara's dress as she walked out into the yard, clutching a wooden bucket. There was no longer the howl of the wind, only the silence of the morning after a storm, a silence so fragile that one feared to speak loudly and break it. Elias had risen early. He stood on the porch, looking out over the pasture. Part of the north fence had collapsed. Some of the timbers were broken. The posts were tilted. The sight made him sigh, not just because of the work at hand, but because the memory of last night still lingered in his mind. He heard footsteps behind him. Clara stepped out, her heavy coat on, her brown hair tied back. She stopped beside him, following his gaze. They were both silent for a long time. "Finally," she said softly, "we should start at the west corner. If we don't fix it soon, the cows will get lost." Elias nodded. No apology, no blame. But there was something softer, warmer in his eyes as he looked at her, like snow melting slowly in the early morning sunlight. They set to work. Clara lifted the old logs and stacked them. Elias used the axe to split new ones. The sound of splintering wood, hammering, and breathing merged into a rhythm peaceful, slow, like the heartbeat of a storm survivor. Clara said nothing, but she could feel Elias's eyes on her, no longer as tense as before. Every time she bent down to lift a piece of wood, he would turn his shoulder slightly, helping without saying a word. Every gesture was measured, as if the two of them had found a way to exist together without invading each other. As the sun rose, sweat soaked the back of her shirt. She stopped and wiped her forehead. "This fence is weak because the posts are not buried deep enough," she said, her voice tinged with humor. Elias chuckled, a rare smile. "Like me always afraid of losing it? So I only bury it enough." The words made her stop and look at him. Just for a second, but enough for the space between them to be filled with honesty. He continued, "I was used to living alone, used to not being needed by anyone. So when she walked out that night, I wasn't angry, just scared. Scared of losing another thing I didn't fully understand." She put down the hammer and looked him straight in the eye. Her voice wasn't harsh, just soft and firm. "I know, but I don't want to be someone you have to keep. I want to be someone you can trust." The words were like sunlight shining through thick clouds. Elias was silent, nodding. "Then I will start again with faith." She smiled, a small, tired, but warm smile. They continued working until noon. When the last post was hammered in, they stood looking out at the straight fence that stretched out into the fields. A gentle breeze was blowing, carrying the scent of dry grass and thawing earth. The sky was so blue that they could almost hear the snow melting on the roofs. Elias sat down, poured water from a wooden jug, and handed it to her. "Does your hand still hurt?" "Yes," she replied, then smiled. "But I think it's healing." He looked at her and saw not only the wound on his hand, but also a deeper wound in his heart slowly closing. A light breeze blew by, ruffling a few strands of her hair. The light fell on her face, making her look like a part of the morning slender yet strong. "Clara." He said her name for the first time, his voice soft. "Thank you for staying." She turned to him, her eyes shining. "I stayed because I chose to." The answer is simple, but it contains the power of freedom and humanity. Elias chuckled, his gaze softening. "Well then, welcome to Montana. For real." They both laughed. The laughter was small and clear, melting into the blue sky like a rustic song of the border region. That afternoon, as the sun was sinking behind the mountains, Elias paused and looked at the fence he had just built. Beside him, Clara was gathering her tools, her brown hair glistening in the sunlight. A warm wind blew through, carrying the scent of freshly cut earth. He thought, perhaps faith does not come from big promises, but from a pair of hands willing to work with you, in the rain, in the wind, and in peace. As for her, when she looked up at the fields, she felt strangely relieved. She no longer felt returned, like the day she left Boston, but rather chosen, living, and trusted. In the twilight, they said nothing more, just stood together by the new fence, where the last light of day fell on their figures. Another beginning, wordless, but full. That night, as the fire burned brightly in the kitchen, Elias told Clara about his ex-wife, who had left him alone in the wilderness. In the golden light of the night, Clara listened, and for the first time, she understood that loss had a voice of its own, gentle and worth listening to. Darkness fell slowly over the Montana plains. The wind had died down, leaving only the crackling of the fire in the hearth and the faint chirp of insects on the edge of the wooden wall. Inside the small house, the smell of smoke mixed with the scent of peppermint tea, warm and light as breath. Clara sat near the fireplace, her hands holding an old, chipped china mug. Elias sat opposite, the firelight reflecting off his face, a face she saw every day. But tonight there was something different. The light in his eyes was deep and far away, as if no one else could reach. They were silent for a long time. Both were tired from the long day, but neither wanted to rest. Something hung between them like the lingering snow on a field, fragile yet real. Finally, Elias spoke first. "Clara," he said slowly, his voice low and husky. "There's something I think you should know before you trust me any more." She nodded slightly, put down the cup. No questions, no urges, just looked at him, her eyes calm, open like a shelter. He took a deep breath. "I had a wife once. Her name was May." The name fell in the middle of the room like a pebble on a still pond, creating silent circles. Clara said nothing, just listened. "She came from Kansas," he continued, "through a matchmaking paper, like you. I was 30 then, and May was 22. She had bright eyes, loved to sing, and hated silence." He smiled, a sad smile, and here, silence is the only thing there is. Clara looked at him. The firelight illuminated his cheeks, highlighting the faint lines. His voice was even, but underneath was a depth of pain that had not yet subsided. "She endured the first winter," Elias said, "laughing at the snow, teaching me church songs. But the following summer she began to change, said it was too far away, too quiet, that the wind at night made her feel as if she were being slowly buried in silence." He bowed his head, clasping his hands together. "I thought she just needed time. I worked harder, tried to build more stables, buy more horses, thinking that if I had enough material things, she would be okay. But she needed something else. She needed people, laughter, voices, someone other than me and the land." His voice stopped. Clara reached out quietly and placed a log on the fire. It crackled, the light rising, illuminating his shadow on the wall, a figure bent under the weight of memory. "She left one morning," Elias said softly, "while I was out in the fields. She left a note. 'I can't stand the silence.'" The words came as a breeze, but Clara could feel the cold seeping through each word. He paused for a long moment, then said softly, 3 months later, they found her on the road back to Kansas. Her horse lost its way, and the wind picked up. She didn't survive the storm. There was no sound of the wood burning, no sound of the wind outside. Only Elias's ragged breathing and the dying flames, red as cold pain. Clara looked at him. No pity. No, I'm sorry. Just a calm presence, like a hand placed on a nameless loneliness. "After a while," she said softly, "maybe she didn't leave because she hated you, Elias, but because she didn't have the strength to stay. This place requires more than love. It requires faith and peace of mind. Not everyone has that." Elias looked up. His eyes met hers, warm eyes like the flickering light of a kerosene lamp. "What about you, Clara?" he asked softly. "Aren't you afraid of this silence?" She smiled softly. "Slowly, I used to be afraid of silence. when I was in Boston, because back then I was afraid to hear my own voice. But here, in silence, I feel more real, and I think she helped him, in another way, to learn to listen, even to the sound of the wind. Elias sat silently, his eyes downcast. A light breeze came through the crack in the door, stirring the flames. He looked at the flames, then said softly, almost in a whisper, "Maybe you're right. Maybe I've never really listened to anyone. Until now." The room fell silent. But it was no longer the cold silence of before. It was the quiet of two souls finding a place of contact, where hurt met understanding, where the past ceased to haunt because it had been listened to. Outside, the moon rose behind the mountain, casting a silvery light on the roofs, the newly erected fences, and the couple sitting across from each other in the firelight. An old chapter closed, and somewhere a new faith was germinating in the silence. In the days that followed, Clara did not ask any more about the past, nor did she talk about herself. They just worked together, lived together, until the day of the town festival approached. And for the first time, Clara stepped out of the farm, carrying with her a strange feeling, both scared and free. Spring in Elk Creek always comes slowly. Snow melts in long streaks down the hillsides, revealing the scent of damp earth and fresh grass. In the town square, cotton flags hang along the wooden fence, the wind rustling, accompanied by the sound of country music from the saloon down the street. Clara stood before the dim mirror in the small room, her hands gently smoothing the brown cloth dress she had sewn herself several nights in a row. It was not a beautiful dress, just simple and neat. But in the early morning light, it made her feel different, no longer the woman returned from the East, but someone walking toward a new life. "Are you leaving?" Elias asked, cowboy hat in hand, standing in the doorway. She turned and smiled. "Just a moment. Mrs. Reed invited me to help set up the bakery. It's a chance to meet people in the area." Elias looked at her, his eyes hesitant. "The people there aren't all nice. Are you afraid of what they will say?" Her voice was soft, but had a familiar streak of independence. He shook his head slightly. "No, it's just—" and then stopped. Finally he said softly, "I'm not good with crowds." Clara nodded. "I know." She smiled, put on her wide-brimmed hat, and stepped outside. The sunlight fell on her shoulders, and for a moment Elias saw the woman walk as if the spring breeze carried her will. Elk Creek was busier than usual. People were streaming in from the surrounding farms, men in rough shirts, women in floral skirts and old lace blouses. The smells of baking bread, smoke, and hay combined to create a borderland aroma, rough but comforting. Clara helped display the cakes in the little booth. Mrs. Reed, the kind-hearted woman who owned the tailor shop, smiled and said, "You are very skillful. Clara, Mr. Monroe must be very lucky." Clara smiled lightly. "I just help him grow vegetables." "Mrs. Reed raised her eyebrows mischievously. "Up here, everyone sees it. A man lives alone for years, and then suddenly a bride arrives from the East. The townspeople are curious. Miss—" The words unintentionally made Clara's heart sink a little. Indeed, when she looked around, several eyes were directed at her, some curious, some mocking, some pitying. Someone whispered, but loud enough for her to hear, "There! The bride bought it. I heard someone else returned it, before reaching Monroe." The whisper was like a thin, cold knife. She still smiled, but something inside her heart tightened. She bent down, pretending to adjust the cake tray, her hands trembling slightly. Part of her wanted to leave. But then, there was another part that was stronger. The part that had lifted its head when it was humiliated in Boston. The part that had traveled halfway across the country to find its self-worth. She lifted her head, looked straight ahead, and continued her work. Then, as dusk began to fall, she heard the distant sound of horse hooves. The whole square turned to look. A man on horseback appeared on the dusty road, tall, hat pulled low, his shadow stretched long in the fading light. "It's Elias." He stopped his horse at the edge of the square, his gaze sweeping over the crowd, then stopping on her. He dismounted and walked towards her, not too fast, not too slow, as if she was the only thing real and everyone else faded into the background. A man whistled softly. A woman whispered, "He's coming to pick her up." Elias did not reply, nor did he look at anyone else. He simply approached, stopping in front of Clara, his eyes quiet but determined. "It's late," he said, his voice low. "I've come to pick you up." Clara was a little embarrassed. "I can do it myself." He shook his head slightly. "I know." A pause. Then he turned to the people around him, not loudly, not defiantly, but each word nailed down. "I don't care what they think. All I know is she's not a commodity. And if anyone dares to call you a bought bride, try working with you for a day out there, see if they can handle it." The air was quiet. Only the wind blew through the rows of oil lamps hanging around the square, swaying gently. Clara looked at him, an indescribable feeling rising in her heart. Not pride, but gratitude mixed with deep warmth. "Mrs." Reed smiled and waved. "Go on. You too. It's getting cold here." Elias nodded, turned back to lead the horse, and said softly, "Get on." Clara followed silently. When he reached out to help her into the saddle, their hands touched rough, chapped, but warm. On the way back, the moon began to rise, illuminating the trees along the path. Elias rode slowly, and Clara sat behind, her hand lightly holding on to his shirt. After a moment, she said softly, "You don't have to come, Elias?" "Perhaps not," he replied, "but I want to. There are some things that cannot be said in silence." She leaned her forehead against his back, eyes closed. In the steady rhythm of the horse's steps, she could hear his heartbeat match hers, steady, real, and enough to drown out all the chatter outside. They reached the farmhouse as the moon was high in the sky. The land around them was silvery. Elias stopped his horse and bent down to help her up. Before he let go, he said softly, his voice hoarse, "You know, I haven't been through that square since May died. But today, I thought, there are wounds that can only be healed by having the courage to return." Clara looked at him, her eyes filled with something gentle, deeper than words. "Thank you for coming back," she said. He smiled his first real smile, without the strain. "It wasn't me who came back, Clara. It was us." The moon shone on the two of them, its light as soft as a drop of water on a blade of grass. And there, in the middle of the vast land, two broken souls were learning to stand side by side, without needing to hide. The following days passed in peaceful silence. The spring breeze carried the scent of fresh grass, and the ground gradually softened after the snow, as if learning to let go of the past. Elias and Clara worked together every day, mending fences, sowing seeds, taking the cows to the fields. Neither of them spoke of the festival, but sometimes, in the silence, their eyes met, and something changed forever. One afternoon, after they had finished their work, They sat down to rest by the wooden fence. It was dusk. A soft golden light spread over the fields like a warm blanket. In the distance, the cows were returning to their barns, the steady ringing of their cowbells blending with the wind whistling through the wide meadows. Clara leaned her elbows on the fence, watching the sun sink lower. The wind blew gently, blowing her brown hair around her face. Elias stood beside her, still holding the wooden hammer, but no longer hammering. He just stared at the scene before him and then at her. The afternoon light fell on Clara's face, making her look like part of the scene, rustic, quiet, and peacefully radiant. Elias suddenly realized that it had been a long time since he had felt his heart pounding so hard, not with burning passion, but with a gentle fear that this moment, if he blinked, would vanish like the evening smoke. "Are you going to add a fence to the south?" Clara asked, her voice low, as if to avoid breaking the wind. "No," he replied. "That side is fine. I just want to stand here for a bit." She turned to look at him, a small smile playing at the corners of her lips. "Just want to stand?" He nodded. "Yeah. Sometimes standing still is a way to understand how far you've come." She was silent, turning towards the sunset. His words were like a whisper, just enough for her to hear, just enough to absorb. The wind changed direction, carrying the scent of earth and the chill from the distant mountains. She pulled her cloak back slightly, and suddenly felt his hand reach out, awkward, not forcing, just touching her wrist lightly, like a question. She did not withdraw her hand. They stood like that, in the rustling wind, the sun slowly sinking behind the trees. The red light spread out, embracing the two silhouettes on the wooden fence. Elias spoke softly, his voice hoarse Clara. Just a name, but it held everything: gratitude, awe, and something greater than words. She turned. The distance between them was only half a step. The sunset reflected in her eyes like a hidden fire. And then, no one said anything more. Elias leaned down, very slowly, as if afraid to break the moment. It wasn't a quick kiss. It wasn't fire. It wasn't passion. Just two people finding a place of peace in the storm of their lives. Their breaths mingled, warm and light as the wind in the fields. A fleeting kiss, but enough to change everything, like the last rays of sunlight touching the hills, turning the sky into a sea of golden gold. When Elias let go, he didn't look at her right away. He just sighed softly, then said, "Perhaps. Though, that is to, lao wow. I've been waiting for this for a long time." Clara smiled, her eyes softening, holding a hint of playfulness he had never seen before. "You're not the only one." The wind blew again, making the grass bend. Crickets began to chirp somewhere in the distance, like an instrumental song from the border region. They sat down on the fence, in silence. Nothing more needed to be said, just watching the sky gradually change from gold to purple, then to the deep blue of night. For a long moment, it seemed as if the whole world stopped to witness the silence between two hearts. Elias reached out and took her hand. It was small and rough, calloused from working in the fields. But when they clasped together, they fit as if they were made for that purpose. "Clara," he said softly, "I don't know what the future holds. The winters can be long here, and the land isn't always kind." She looked at him, her eyes serious but warm. "Elias," she replied, "I'm not looking for an easy place. I'm looking for a real place." He nodded, and they both looked out over the meadow. Above, the sun had set, leaving a thin pink streak like the last red streak of the day. She said softly, almost in a whisper, "Did you hear that?" Hear what the sound of the wind. It was like singing. Elias tilted his head and listened. Sure enough, the wind was whistling softly through the hedge, creating a low, steady sound, like a distant violin. He laughed, so softly that only she could hear. Perhaps that is the music of this land, for those who stay. She looked at him. Her smile in the sunset was softer than the wind. When night fell, they left the fence and walked together to the little cabin where the oil lamp was already lit. No one spoke of the kiss, for they did not need to. It lay in the meadow, in the wind, and in the stars that were beginning to twinkle in the sky. And in the midst of that vast sky and earth, the two are no longer alone. The morning was like any other. The sun rose slowly, its rays filtering through the dew-soaked meadows, and the wind from the mountains still carried a gentle chill. Elias led his horse out to the paddock, a black stallion he had tamed only a few weeks earlier. Clara stood in the doorway, a cup of coffee in her hand, watching his figure in the early morning light, a familiar figure, strong, calm, as if he had been carved out of this land. "Be careful, Elias," she said, half joking, half worried. He just looked back, smiling slightly. "I've lived through many winters here. Clara, a little horse like this can't hurt me." She shook her head slightly, smiling. There was something about him that made you believe, like believing the sun would rise. But a few minutes later, the smile faded. A loud neigh rang out from afar. The black horse was startled by the shot of a shotgun echoing from the other side of the hill. It reared wildly. Elias tried to hold the reins, but missed. For a moment, Clara saw his body thrown off, hit the ground hard, and lay motionless. The cup shattered at her feet. She ran, as if the wind couldn't keep up. When she reached her destination, Elias was still lying there, sweat and dust covering his face. Blood seeped from his forehead, soaking into the dry earth. "Elias," she called hoarsely. There was no response. She knelt, her hand shaking as she placed it on his chest. His heart was still beating weak but steady. A gasp escaped her lips, a mixture of fear and relief. "Do you hear me?" she whispered, trying to keep her voice calm. "Don't sleep. You can't leave me here." There was no answer. Only the wind blew, ruffling her hair and carrying the scent of blood and earth. She struggled to lift him up and drag him home. Everything seemed to fade. Only his faint warmth was real. When she finally got him inside, she laid him down near the fireplace and quickly lit a fire. The flickering firelight illuminated his face, pale, dusty, but still the face of the man she trusted. She cleaned the wound, changed the bandage, each movement slow and careful. As her hands touched his skin, she realized she had never seen a human being so fragile, and never had she wanted to protect anyone so much. Outside, a light rain began to fall. The small house was bathed in the warm glow of the fire. She sat beside him, her eyes never leaving him. Every time he moaned softly, she held his hand tightly, as if afraid he would slip away from this world. Time passed without a trace. She had no idea how much time had passed. Maybe a few hours, maybe all night. All she knew was that, in the silence, her heartbeat was beating steadily and persistently in sync with the crackling of the fire. As the sky began to lighten, Elias stirred slightly. His eyes opened slowly, hazy in the light, seeing her sitting there, her hair disheveled and her eyes dark. He frowned slightly. "Clara, what's wrong with me?" She smiled, though tears were falling down her cheeks. You just aged me 10 years. Monroe. He tried to sit up, but she stopped him. Don't. You're weak. Stay still. Elias was silent, his eyes still fixed on her, not of pain, but of astonishment. Perhaps he had not expected to wake up, and even less expected that the woman who had said she would only stay to work would sit there all night, holding his hand as if his life depended on it. All night. You didn't rest? He asked. She shook her head. I can't. He looked aside, where the fire was still burning. His voice was hoarse and hesitant. You don't have to stay. I used to think, if something happened, you would leave. She was silent for a moment, then spoke softly, slowly but surely, each word falling like a heartbeat I was sent back once before. Elias, but this time, I choose to stay. He looked at her, said nothing, just let out a soft sigh, a long sigh, as if the wind in his heart had finally calmed. She leaned over, adjusting the blanket over him. The firelight reflected off their faces, creating a strangely tender scene, a wounded man, and a woman sitting beside him, her eyes shining with free choice. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind carried the smell of damp earth, the smell of life returning after its ordeal. Elias closed his eyes, his voice a whisper close to a prayer. Thank you, Clara. Not because you saved me, but because you stayed. She smiled slightly. We've both been through too much to give up so easily. The hearth still burned, its light reflecting off their hands as they touched, rough, calloused, but steady. They were both silent, letting the fire speak for what they could not say, that this love was not salvation, but companionship, in pain or in peace. As dawn crept through the crack in the door, golden light shone into the small room, covering the couple sitting close together. In that moment, all wounds, both physical and mental, seemed to be healed by the warmth of trust. The next day, Elias woke up in the new sunlight. He said what he had kept hidden for so long, not because he was afraid of being rejected, but because he was afraid of not being worthy. And for the first time, Clara heard the awkward but heartbreaking confession. That morning, the air was cool and clear. The rain from the night before had left the grass on the porch still wet, and the scent of new earth wafted up like the breath of the earth. The summer sunlight filtered through the east-facing window Elias had just set up, illuminating the small wooden room where he lay resting, while Clara sat beside him, holding a warm towel. The fever had passed. The color had returned to his face, still pale, but more vibrant. When Elias opened his eyes, he saw Clara sitting quietly mending the piece of his shirt that had torn in his fall the day before. The light shone on her hands, rough, smeared with ointment, but to him the most beautiful hands in the world. He stirred slightly. You haven't rested yet. She looked up and smiled. It's good you're asleep. I was just sewing my shirt. Elias looked at her for a long moment. Not because of what she said, but because of her voice, so soft and true that it made his heart sink. All his patience, all the words he had wanted to say for so long, seemed to be gone. He took a deep breath, searching for words. Clara. She stopped and looked up. Yes. He sat up a little, though he was still in pain. Maybe I should have said this a long time ago, but I didn't know the right way to do it. She looked at him, waiting. The morning light fell on his face, no longer as hard as usual, but with something awkward, honest like a child, afraid of doing something wrong. He bowed his head, then said slowly, but clearly, "Clara, I'm in love with you. I don't know when it started, nor how to say it right. I just know it's happening, even though I didn't mean to do anything about it." The words rang out, so simply that it made the room quieter than ever. Clara did not answer immediately. She sat still, looking at him, her eyes seemingly filled with 1,000 unspoken words. He thought he had made a mistake, that he should not have spoken at that moment. But then she gently put the shirt aside and stepped closer. "Elias," she said softly, her voice soft as a breath, "do you know what the first thing I thought when I saw you lying there yesterday?" He shook his head. "I thought, if you leave, I don't know where I'll go. I thought I was used to loss, but it turns out the fear of losing you is greater than anything." She paused, then sat down next to him, her hand touching his. "So, if you're clumsy about saying, 'I love you,' then let me be clumsy with you." Elias smiled slightly, a small smile that warmed his eyes. He squeezed her hand, his hand small but firm. "I'm not good at talking. I only know how to do. But this time, I want to make it clear to you. So there's no more guessing. You just said it," she replied, her eyes shining, and I heard it. Outside, a gentle breeze blew, carrying with it the first chirping of birds. The door shook slightly, the sound of wood clanking like background music for that peaceful moment. No need for flowers, no need for vows, just two people, two hands clasped, and the morning light. Elias said softly, half joking, half serious. "Aren't you afraid life isn't easy here? This land is harsh, and I am not the best man." She shook her head, looking out at the fields where the green grass was catching the sun. "I've lived my whole life among good people who weren't real. Elias, here, at least I know I'm with someone who is honest. And that's enough." He was silent. Then he leaned over and placed his hand on her cheek, a rough, warm hand that smelled of pine and burnt wood. She didn't flinch. She just closed her eyes, letting the warmth speak for the words he couldn't. A moment later, she opened her eyes and smiled slightly. "It's strange. Elias, before, I thought love had to be noisy and grand, but now I just feel that if I can sit next to someone, listen to the wind, and feel at peace, then perhaps that is love." He looked at her and nodded. "Yes, no more needed." They sat like that for a long time. No one said anything. Only the sunlight moved slowly across the floor, as if silently witnessing the change in them. Two people who were once afraid of love, now learning to trust again. Elias looked at their clasped hands, then said softly, "Do you remember the window I put up?" "The one facing east," she nodded. "I built it because I thought, if one day you stay, you will want to see the sunrise." Clara smiled, her eyes slightly moist. "I think I see it, Elias." Outside, the sun was high in the sky. The blades of grass were swaying, and in the distance, the wind blowing through the meadow sounded like a song without words, simple, honest, and warm, like their love. In a small house in the middle of a vast border, two people who seemed lost found a place to belong, not by fate, but by choice. That afternoon, Clara went out to the porch to dry her blankets, while Elias went out to the fields to check on the horses. The sky was surprisingly clear, but on the horizon, dark clouds began to gather, a sign of big changes to come. However, the storm did not come that day. Instead, The next morning the sky was so clear that one could see the pale green mountains in the distance. The dawn cast a thin layer of gold on the ground and on the dewdrops on the grass, sparkling like glass beads. The air was strangely quiet, only the early morning wind rustling through the wooden fence and the cries of a few stray birds. Clara woke early. She put on the simplest dress she owned, a faded beige with frayed cuffs. She tied her hair back and stepped out onto the porch. Elias was already standing there, in a clean white shirt, no blood or dirt. The morning light shone on his face, highlighting the tan lines, the marks of a man who had spent his life in the land. "Why are you up so early?" she asked, her voice low and trembling, as if afraid to wake the quiet room. "Couldn't sleep," he replied, then hesitated. "I think today should be the day." "What day?" she asked, though she already knew. "The day we start over, officially." She was silent, looking at him for a long moment. There was no pleading or drama in his eyes, only the certainty of someone who had lost too much, and now understood that everything precious should be held in peace. He held out his hand. "Will you go to the field with me?" She placed her hand in his, and they walked away. They crossed the field behind the farm, where the weeds were tall and the wind blew. Elias's black horse followed, a silent witness. In the distance, the sun was rising over the horizon, its light painting the prairie gold. Elias stopped on a high knoll, overlooking the small farm and the mountains to the west. He turned, looked at Clara, and said softly, "No priest, no ring, but I think earth, sky, wind, that's enough." Clara chuckled. "Enough for me." They stood facing each other. No loud words, no ceremony, no fancy clothes. Just two people who knew what it was like to lose, and therefore understood the value of staying. Elias pulled a small, old, soft leather strap from his pocket. "This was used to tie my horse. Now, if you'll allow me, I'd like to tie it around your wrist." Clara held out her hand. He wrapped the rope around her wrist, tying it in a tight knot. The sunlight caught it, making it glow a deep brown plain, unflattering, but as durable as the land itself. "It doesn't look like a wedding ring," she whispered. He replied, his voice hoarse but warm. "The ring can fall, but this chain won't." She smiled, and the dawn seemed brighter in her smile. Then she did the same thing, took a small piece of cloth from her dress and wrapped it around his wrist. When the knot was tied, she raised her head. "That's it. You can't go anywhere now." Elias chuckled. "I don't want to go either." The wind blew a little harder, making the grasses sway as if in ceremonial applause. A nearby horse tossed its head and snorted in approval. There was no music, no flowers, just the sound of the wind and the earth. But in that silence, there was something more sacred than any church or wedding ceremony that people had ever created. Elias reached out and gently touched her cheek. "I promise," he said. "I will never let you go anywhere else unless you want me to." Clara looked at him, tears in her eyes. "And I," she replied, "promise never to leave out of fear again." They looked at each other for so long that time seemed to stand still. And then, without another word, Elias leaned down and kissed her forehead, a kiss that was undemanding, filled with respect and gratitude. In the distance, the sun rose higher, shining through the thin layer of clouds, pouring down on the grassland, covering them in a soft light. The sound of wind, insects, horses scratching the ground, all blended into an unwritten prairie song that could only be heard with the heart. Then they set off together, not in a hurry. Their footsteps echoed with the rustling of the grass. Elias led the horse, and Clara walked beside him, their hands occasionally brushing against each other. "Clara," he called softly, "I don't know what people say after they get married, but I think maybe just make a good breakfast." She laughed. "If you do the dishes, I'll bake a cake." "Deal," he replied, his voice joking, but his eyes shone with something deeper than joy. When they reached the porch, the sun was shining brightly. On the old wooden table, the coffee pot was still warm, and in the thin smoke rising from it, 2 straps of leather and cloth could be clearly seen, simple, but as durable as the promise they had made. Clara received the letter while sitting on the porch, holding a steaming cup of coffee. The wind from the prairie blew gently, making the envelope tremble in her hand. The red seal faded, the word Boston clearly visible, the place that had witnessed her departure with a broken heart. She was silent for a long time, then opened the letter. Just a few lines, short and cold like the writer himself. The man, the one who once sent her back, said that he now had a family, hoping she would forgive his childish temper. He concluded with the sentence, "I hope you have found a place that suits you." Clara read without tears or anger. She just smiled, a soft, peaceful smile like the morning breeze. In the past, such words would have made her tremble, make her feel small. But now, she felt as calm as the surface of the water. Elias stepped out and asked quietly, "Where is it from Boston?" She replied, folding the letter. He looked at her, was silent for a moment, then simply said, "I don't care what's inside, as long as you're okay." She smiled faintly. "I'm not just okay. Elias, I'm free." That evening, as the fire burned in the hearth, Clara sat down to write in the old leather journal Elias had given her on their wedding day. Her handwriting was steady, slanted slightly to the right, careful, but full of life. "I was called stubborn. In Boston, it sent me back. Here, amid the winds and rocks of Montana, it makes me loved. Perhaps everyone needs a place to be themselves, without being corrected, without being judged. For me, the place is not the city, nor the house with the high roof, but beside someone who sees me even in silence. In this place, amidst the wilderness and the wind, I no longer feel alone." She closed the book and reached out to brush away the ashes that had fallen from the fireplace. The firelight flickered on the wall, trembling like the breath of the night. Elias entered, holding 2 wooden cups. "Peppermint tea," he said. "You like it, don't you?" "Yes," she said softly. "I remember." He sat down beside her, saying nothing more. They both looked at the fire burning in the hearth, the golden light reflecting in their eyes. Clara saw in those eyes what she had longed for, not admiration, but respect. "Elias," she said softly, "do you ever think we came together too late?" He shook his head, his eyes still on the fire. "No. I think we came just in time to learn how to love properly." That simple answer made her smile, a real smile. The next morning was clear and breezy. Elias led his horse out of the stable, and Clara took the diary. She put it in her saddlebag, and they rode out into the fields. They headed east, where the sun was rising, its light gilding the grass. No one said a word. There was only the steady sound of hooves and the smell of fresh grass. Clara raised her head and looked ahead. The dawn was spreading, like a bright orange silk. "It's beautiful," she whispered. Elias nodded. "I think That's what they call a new beginning. She turned to him, smiling. How many new beginnings have we had, Elias? He replied, as many sunrises as there have been. That answer made her laugh. Then she was silent, watching the light spreading across the horizon. In that moment, she saw clearly the path they had taken from misunderstandings, hurt, to trust, a journey that was not short, not easy, but true, and like that morning light. Their love was not bright, not noisy, just warm and lasting, like a flame meeting a flame, burning slowly, but not extinguished. They stopped on a grassy hill where the wind blew hard and the space opened up endlessly. Clara took out her diary and wrote one last line. If someone asks me what love is, I would say it is when two flames do not burn each other, but light each other up. She closed the book and turned to look at Elias. He was looking at her, his gaze like the morning sun reflected in those pale gray eyes, quiet and deep. Thank you, she said. For what? For not being afraid of me. Elias smiled slightly, his hand taking hers, squeezing gently. You're not scary, Clara. You're just more real than the others. She was silent, letting the wind blow through her hair, carrying a light laugh. In the distance, the sun had risen, its golden light spreading across the grassland, illuminating the two figures riding side by side. And there, in the middle of the vast grasslands, a man and a woman, once two broken pieces, found a way to burn together. No strings attached, no extravagant promises, just two flames, meeting, holding each other, and lighting the way forward. They say the frontier is for those strong enough to survive. But Clara and Elias prove sometimes it's kindness and determination that keeps people alive in the wilderness. And where fire meets fire, they find what the world once took away from them, faith and love, simple but eternal. Some people come to test us, and some come to see who we really are. Clara Whitmore was sent back as defective goods, but in the Montana wilderness, she found someone who didn't want to change her, but wanted to grow with her. Elias Monroe didn't teach her how to be gentle. He just showed her that sometimes that stubbornness is what helps people survive the storms and prejudices. Their story reminds us that true love is not about saving, but about sharing. It's not perfect. It's not flashy, but it's sincere. And in a world that constantly tells us to fit in, perhaps the most courageous thing is to dare to be true to ourselves, to dare to keep that little flame alive, even when everyone tells us it's wrong. If you ever feel judged, misunderstood, or too much for someone, remember, there is someone out there looking for you. Someone who will not extinguish that flame, but will light it with you. Thank you for staying until the end of the story. If you feel warm, please like, share, and subscribe to Frontier Hearts channel so that every week we can go through small stories in the dusty West where people learn to love, trust, and live kindly, even though life is not easy.